It's time for us to decolonize coaching.
Yes. Okay. Before we go into that, I
Sure.
think there's a wonderful question that coaches can ask themselves, and that is, have I got the courage or determination to seek out clients who will irritate me? And
That's a great one. Thank you
you know,
for pausing me. I appreciate that. Yeah, because your teacher just arrived when that happened. Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple, a practical podcast that guides clinical leaders and healthcare managers to create trust and support with their teams. I'm your host, Trace Hobson. Join me for weekly interviews, practical tools, and inspiring transformational stories of bringing people together in healthcare. Now, let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple. My name is Trace Hobson. I'm your host, and this is the podcast that is created for clinical leaders, managers, and teams that want to learn how to create a safe space in the middle of healthcare disruption. Today's episode is a very special one. We have David Clutterbuck, Professor David Clutterbuck from the UK. Professor Clutterbuck is an expert in team coaching, leadership development, mentorship, and coach supervision. He's also a prolific author who's written 80 plus books on team coaching, leadership, and how to develop people inside of organizations. Professor Clutterbuck and I had a vibrant conversation about decolonization, about leadership development and coaching, and systemic approaches in today's organizations that are disrupted, healthcare organizations and others. I know today's show is going to serve you powerfully. So without further ado, let's get right into it. David, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And so for those that are listening, that are coming from a clinical leadership perspective that may not know a lot about your work, can you just start off by sharing a little bit about the work you do in the world and maybe even, what's got you, what has your attention right now? What are you working on right now?
okay, well, it's been a fantastic journey over the past 40 something years, 45 years, in this whole world of coaching, mentoring, talent development, particularly working in systemic talent management. And everything that I've been doing has been working in increasing levels of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And we did a piece of research last year for the conference board. And one of the big worries for HR directors across Europe was that so many senior leaders can't think in systems.
Mm.
They can get complicated a bit, but complex or chaotic is beyond them. And that's one of the big issues that we're facing across the world. That leaders need to be able to cope with complexity better, and therefore coaches and mentors who are going to be working with them also need to be very good at coping with and seeing complexity.
Yeah, that's interesting that you're saying that, because right now I'm just working on a graduate research proposal that is going to delve into the area of systems in healthcare. And so when you say working systemically, I'm curious, what is it that you mean by that?
Well, let's start at the very base, really. When we work with a team and somebody says, come and help us with our team, we've got some conflict going on. And the typical approach would be, oh, yes, I'm a consultant. I can come in, I'll do some team building, or I'll do some conflict resolution or some mediation. And immediately you're focusing on a symptom, not on the complexity of issues that are going on. And the presented issue is always not the real issue. It's a symptom of other things that are happening, the interplay between forces. And so a lot of my research over the last 10 years has been increasingly focused on identifying ways in which we can manage that complexity to help individuals and teams see the complexity around them. And because they can see the whole system, identify better ways to make that whole system more effective rather than just play with a little bit of it.
Mm. I wonder what it is that an individual leader or coach needs to do within themselves to work systemically in the way that you're describing. Because one of the ideas that I have that I'm exploring is this idea that systemic work is really rooted in and starts within your own neurobiological system, your own body, your own awareness, your consciousness. And then there's things that you can do internally to work systemically from there that naturally dovetail with those larger systems you're describing, whether it's a team or even a relationship with one person or larger systems. I'm curious what you think about what it is that coaches and leaders need to do within themselves to work systemically.
Well, I think what you've described is a process of becoming more aware, more sensitive to what's happening. A lot of the work I'm doing with people who are neurodivergent is fascinating because most forms of neurodivergence involve a higher level of sensitivity to particular things.
Right.
So if somebody is on the autistic spectrum, they will have a higher level of sensitivity to patterns. In fact, Baron Cohen, the neurobiologist, refers to them as the pattern seekers. If somebody is an HSP, a highly sensitive person, they will have high levels of sensitivity to emotion, and particularly the emotional undercurrents within a team or an environment. And so tuning in to as wide a spectrum of issues as we can makes a lot of sense. If we look at how some of the dogma that it originates in the United States around how coaches should go about coaching. So the idea of the grow model, start off with the goals and then work from there. No evidence for this actually. There's no real empirical data for this whatsoever. And in fact, when we look at it, and we look at the evidence around the studies there are, suggest that goals are emergent most of the time. Whatever the goal that the person starts with, if the coaching is any good, that's going to evolve and change into something else.
Interesting.
And if we take a systemic perspective on this, if we just start with the goal, we're blinkered. It's like the sniffer dog trying to find something, following the trail along the ground, when all they need to do is to lift up and look like this, and the hunter can see where the bird has fallen, but the dog has got to sniff their way to it. And so we by enlarging our senses and awareness, we have a much deeper understanding of what's going on. So it's not more of a helicopter view if you like. But if we look at some cultures, which are not westernized cultures, rather than start with what's the problem, or the issue, they will start with what's the context. And so somebody may come to coaching and say, well, look, I've got this sense that things aren't right, and I know that I need to do something, but I'm not sure I understand enough of what's going on to be quite clear about what I should be doing. And so the purpose of the coaching, as increasingly we find, is actually to help people define the goal. The goal is the outcome. It's not the starting point. And I compare it to try and do a jigsaw. You've turned all the pieces over so they're color side up. And you can start by saying, "Oh, those little bits will look like a cottage or a face or whatever." So I can see those bits go together, and so you focus on that. But that's one way to put a jigsaw together. Alternatively, you can start by saying, "Well, let's find all the bits that have got a straight edge, and we'll put the outsides on first, and then we'll work in from the outside."
And so the straight edges, from your perspective, are the context and not the problem. So that's a really interesting way to look at it. And it resonates with me in my coaching and leadership approach as well, in that the problems are sort of the initial vehicle that we get into to begin to travel, but we're very quickly needing to listen to what's underneath the problems. Problems aren't something to be solved. There's something to be listened to as signals or messages that start to lead us into that uncertain place or that emergent place. And so what does a leader need to develop? Like, as I think about the people that are listening to this particular podcast, they're clinical leaders, nurse educators, managers who are working in a very disrupted healthcare system. And so as I think about them, what is it that they need? What's the kind of the smallest system input inside of them that they began to work with? You mentioned awareness and consciousness. what do they do with the reactiveness that they feel inside at times with the incredible onslaught of uncertainty and complexity?
But there's multiple ways to respond to that, but I think let's take it from the view of empathy or sympathy or empathy. I mean, when we in our research on highly effective coaches and mature coaches, we over the years we've been able to look at different mindsets that people have. And the most mature coaches have a mindset which is much more about connectedness than it is about problem solving. It doesn't use it's not focused on the process, it's focused on the conversation. What's the conversation the person needs to have with themselves? How can I hold them while they have that conversation? And what we find is that models-based coaches, the sort of most immature level, if you like. I don't like these words, immature particularly. But let's say a beginner coach who's following the process, they're following the grow model or some other model they've got, and they're in danger because an AI can do it better than they can very often. But they may develop empathy with the person. But the more mature you get, the more you move towards empathizing with with the system. So having compassion for the system as a whole, not just for the individual within it. Health professionals are really good, although they do sometimes suffer from compassion fatigue, but they're mostly pretty good at having compassion for the individual. But stretching that to having compassion for the system gives you a lot more potential to make real change happen.
Wow, I love what you're sharing there, because I think that for me, that the way that lands is the idea of stewardship rather than individualization. Now let's pivot a little bit. I'm curious what you think. And now you're sitting in the UK, I'm sitting in Canada. Both of us, I think, are experiencing in our society some pretty disrupted healthcare systems.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about what do you hear those systems or your system in healthcare saying? What are the signals that are being sent that as you listen to them, how do you interpret them?
Well, I think one of the problems is that because it's so big, I mean, we're talking getting on for 1.5 million people employed in the health service in the UK. I mean, that's vast. It's big, it's bureaucratic, and it's disconnected in all the wrong ways. At one point, the people at the hospitals had over 1,000 targets to reach. How the hell are you going to do that? It's not feasible. So the political system and because it is a political entity, and so the disjoint between the politics and the reality of doing things in the wards and in emergency departments and so forth is so vast that there's a lot to be mended there, and it is difficult to see the whole thing as a system. Now, there's an example that I find quite fascinating of an ambulance department struggling. And as I understand it, what basically happened was that because there are so many aged patients in taking up beds on the wards, when they are well enough to be moved into less intensive care, but of course, the social services don't have the budgets or the people or the resources to take them out, so they're called bed blockers. That has an impact on people in accident and emergency, being basically blocking up all the space there. So people waiting to get into accident emergency are now waiting in the being kept outside in the ambulances for 2 or 3 hours.
Right.
You begin to get the picture of this, and of course it doesn't get better; it gets worse and worse with time, and all of the angst and the feeling of people in the system that the helplessness, and everybody blames everybody else, of course. Now, in this particular system, as I understand it, what happened was the ambulance people suggest, hang on, let's look at the whole system. So what if we all put a little bit of budget into hiring a hotel and putting people into supportive care, but not intensive care, and moving all those bed blockers out into that hotel for a period of time, and freed up the whole system. It's a simplistic but I think very powerful example of how looking at the whole system can actually make enormous differences.
Interesting. So it's also somebody, a human being in that system listened. They started to listen in a different way than everybody else was as well. So when you think about team coaching, you've been a prolific author. I mean, what does your book count up to? 70 books that you've written?
No, I'm getting on for 80 now.
80 now. So I have to ask you how you're writing so many books at some point, but you've written the book and many books on team coaching. And when you think about systemic team coaching, what does systemic team coaching have to offer to leaders in a system like we're describing in healthcare?
Well, firstly, let's make a distinction. I think the word systemic team coaching has got sort of has got a lot of baggage attached to it, or the phrase has got a lot of baggage attached to it. Mm-hmm. If you think about the work of Dave Snowden and his 4 levels of complexity, so simple systems, complicated systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems.
Right. Right. For those that don't know, that's the Kinevin model.
Yes.
Yeah.
The days when most issues were somewhere between simple and complicated, they're long gone. Mm-hmm. And if you think about what systemic team coaching typically is perceived to do, it's about this. It's about helping the team work with each of its stakeholders and its internal environment individually. But complex adaptive systemic approaches take us beyond that. They look at the interactions between the stakeholders as well, and how those influence the team, and how the team can gain greater leverage by influencing those interactions between the stakeholders, which is what actually happened with the ambulance example. I talk a lot about pain in the system. It's an exercise we do. We get people to think about, where is the pain in the system? And so you take each of the organs of the body. So where's the headaches, the big headaches felt? The guts, where is there a lack of courage? Mm-hmm. The nose, the smell, a sense of smell. Where are the dead bodies rotting, and so forth. I mean, but you can have some fun with the analogies,
right?
But it's very helpful to actually see each of the, look at the system from multiple perspectives and the interaction between those perspectives, and that's where we've been going in more recent years. Mm-hmm. And the diagnostic that we've developed, called the peril diagnostic, is incredibly powerful in the sense that it reveals these interactions. So it doesn't say, well, this, you've got a problem with X or with Y. It looks in a great deal of detail at how those processes do interact.
Yeah, so interesting. One of the models that I've been playing with and allowing to emerge for me is this idea of 4 channels of awareness. There's me and what I have going on inside of me in my system. There's what I notice over there with you that's going on in your system. Then there's the space between, and that's the space you're talking about now. And then there's this other channel of awareness that natural systems have that are on a much higher frequency of information, I think, than most of our sort of manufactured systems that we have in organizations. I think of going and walking in the forest, or experiencing the planetary system and the way that works. So there's this sense of systemic awareness that can go all the way up in a scaled way. And so when you're talking about that space in between and working with that space between, what are you doing inside of you as a coach that's important to be aware of in that space between?
I think a lot of it comes down to being aware of your own assumptions and questioning your assumptions.
Yeah, I think I heard you on an interview say that um, if you haven't questioned an assumption in the last month, then that may be a problem for you to look at. You might like, what's the assumption? I think the question you asked is, what's the assumption that you look back on and that's happened in the last month that you thought, man, that was not a smart assumption.
Yeah, and just doing that on a regular basis, training ourselves to do that,
Hmm.
it's quite remarkable. Um, and I think it's the way that we keep ourselves sharp and alive. And one of the things that I guide coaches that I supervise to do is to go out and to look at their portfolio. Who are their clients?
Hmm.
Are your clients people like you?
Right.
Because if your clients are people like you, um, however you define that, then the capacity to be surprised and to be challenged is reduced.
Right. Right. That's interesting. Also, the capacity to be, you use the word challenged. I would even use the word activated or triggered at times,
Mm,
because if I'm in the presence of somebody who thinks really differently than me, then my natural biases are going to be activated at times by that interaction. And therein lies the work I think you're describing inside of me. It's like, no, it's not about what's going on over there. It's actually what's going on in here. And then doing the work inside of me so that I can do the work outside of me as well. So I love that distinction that you're making there. And there's also this other thing that this taps on that I heard you talk about, which is that it's time for us to decolonize coaching.
yes.
And
Okay.
I
Before we go into that, um to follow to finish off
please
uh, on the other point that we were just talking about, I
sure.
think there's a wonderful question that coaches can ask themselves, and that is, have I got the courage or determination to seek out clients who will irritate me?
that's
And
that's a great one. Thank you
you know,
for pausing me. I appreciate that. Yeah, because your teacher just arrived when that happened.
yeah. And, and to actually say, well, why? What is it about this person that irritates me? What can I learn from actually managing this irritation? And listening to them. That's
Mm.
when we need to up the listening significantly.
Yeah, embodied listening, like listening to the way that that's landing inside of your gut or your
Yeah.
heart or your, yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for that, David. Appreciate that. I think that kind of connects to the other question I'm asking you too, because in Canada we have a very colonized approach to healthcare that has been in the system for a long time, and of course, colonization is what started this whole process. And I know that in the UK that you're quite familiar with colonization as well. And so when you made the comment that it's time for us to decolonize coaching, what did you mean by that? And how does that connect also to what you're talking about around the irritation? Because when I look at colonization, it seems like it's trying to just sort of strip out any kind of irritants, any kind of things that might not fit into the boxed in hierarchical way of doing things. So there's a resistance to anything that is like outside of that. But at the same time, hierarchical systems like are not working anymore. They're really breaking down. And so how do we decolonize coaching? Why do we want to do that? And what's your experience with that?
Well, if we start with the concept of competencies. And competencies have a real value in terms of establishing some standards that people work to. The problem is that competencies are usually based upon the opinions and study of people who've been doing something for a while.
Right.
Um, and inevitably, if you're doing that in a particular cultural context, you're going to have all the cultural biases of that culture of the context they're in. And so what's happened is that we've got a prescriptive model of coaching that many coaches use, and particularly if if they're part of all of the professional bodies have got competencies. Um, um, The ICF has more members than the others, and therefore there are more people sticking or trying to adhere to those competencies. But there's a disjointedness here, in the sense that the competencies actually, when you grow and become masterful, you leave most of that stuff behind. And so becoming masterful is actually about breaking the rules, not sticking to the rules. And it's also about being culturally appropriate. So the way that coaching is perceived in Saudi Arabia is very different from the way that it's perceived in Germany, from the way that it's perceived in Norway, and the way that it's perceived in the United States or Canada, for example. I was just in the Solomon Islands. I was fascinated by some of the ways that they approach coaching. So it's a culture where tradition and family and tribal connections are still very, very important. And so somebody says, I've got this issue, I've got a problem, and they bring it to coaching. Yes, you can use the standard westernized models, or you can say, okay, well, let's, as they might do, they might say, well, okay, what are the parables, the stories that have relevance here? Taking us back to the Bible. The parables of Jesus, trying to teach people or help people think their issues through. Excuse me. It's not, it's part of our ancient tradition, but that's sort of been forgotten, set aside. You don't tell stories. Well, actually, do in large parts of the world. And when they find a story that's relevant, they then say, okay, now how does that help you with your thinking? And what was even more fascinating for me was the fact that there is a big link in the Solomon Islands between parable, the story, and dance.
Interesting.
And the concept that you might actually, as coach and coachee, dance to the rhythm, to the story, to a story, to a dance that's relevant to the story, in order to build rapport and to stimulate thinking. Now, you won't find that in the competency frameworks.
Well, it's interesting. I think it might be emerging, because in the MCC paradigm, or in sort of, you mentioned mastery, in that mastery practice that emerges, there is this sense of dancing with the emergent, what is showing up in that space between. And I think of the work of David White, the poet David White, who talks about working with the conversational nature of reality, and how there's this conversational nature of reality that's always talking to us if we'll listen to it. And in the coaching space, I think it's the same as well. So I love the way that you're talking about that as a decolonization of coaching. And so when we're in systems that are incredibly difficult, like in healthcare, what would you suggest to a leader or a coach who does really want to do something differently, and is wanting to see decolonization happen, but then also not really knowing what to do exactly?
Well, I think it comes back again to sensitization. And we've got a couple of programs that we've been doing for some time now, one for 10 years or more, which are highly relevant, I think. One of them is ethical mentoring. And when I talk mentoring here, I talk real mentoring, not the mixture of mentoring and sponsorship, but real historically accurate mentoring. So helping somebody, using your wisdom to help somebody else think and become wiser themselves.
Right.
So it's really coaching plus, if you like. And so we equip them with an understanding of the psychology of ethical decision making, and a lot of practice with issues of, particularly around diversity related issues. And these ethical mentors, we've got several hundred of them now operating within the UK National Health Service, helping people to identify, have I got an ethical dilemma? And if so, what is the most appropriate way to deal with that? One of the things the positive things is stopping whistleblowing.
Say more about that.
Well, if you've got a release valve, because whistleblowing happens when nobody's listened to. but the mentor is somebody who listens to you and can help you be more widely listened to.
Right. So you build in a relief. I love that metaphor of a relief valve. I think that's exactly what happens. And you kind of open up the valve and you can let some of that relief out. When you say ethical, like you just mentioned, the course that you provide or have provided for 10 years, what are a couple of the steps that somebody would go through to know whether or not they're coming through the lens of an ethical framework like that?
So there's a 6-step framework that we teach them, which starts off with that with basically defining the issue and who's involved and the impacts around that, and gradually what works through to looking at what are the values being applied here, and and a lot of questions around, are we being truly honest with ourselves, for example. What's not being said here, and ultimately to what we call is zones of ethical acceptability. So there are, and these are really significant in any health environment. The an ethical approach to, I don't know. Let's see. I do a lot with Medicine Sans Frontières, and an ethical approach is, who do you touch? Well, you don't say we don't. There's at this end of the spectrum, there's a whole bunch of things which you couldn't possibly do, and at this end there's a bunch of things you couldn't possibly do. But how big is the bit in the middle, and what are the choices? How are the values that you create? What are the values you apply to looking at the things in the middle? So it's a way of really sort of looking in detail at what's going on in the wider system, as well as for the individual.
I think part of what you're describing, a key component has got to be that dialogue that's going on between the mentor and the mentee in that whole thing as well, because you can't do things in a vacuum. There's something that needs to happen in that relational space as well, so that that person can feel a sense of support and confidence with the ethical decision they're trying to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've learned, and we've never done any empirical studies on this, but we've just talked to thousands of people at different levels and in all organizations, but then in the health service too. And most people and most teams feel they are victims of the system rather than influencers of it.
That's it. Yeah, that's 100% right. I work with teams and leaders and people that feel that way every day. And the agency that is being asked for there, or awareness of the agency that exists, starts with one person and then one team and then a department. It kind of flows out from there.
Yeah. So with an ethical mentor can help link people together, who can be their own Me Too movement, if you like.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So one of the things that you mentioned in an interview I recently listened to that was that caught a misconception that people have about working in organizations. Oftentimes when either if you're external that's going into an organization or you're inside an organizational, there's this idea that you need to work at the top in order to affect change. And I heard you say that that's actually not correct at all, that the most change is potentially could happen from the middle, going from the middle up and the middle down. And so just for those that are listening that are sort of in that middle place and wondering, what can I do? Tell us a little bit more about your perspective on that, because I thought that was really interesting and it's a different take.
Well, one of the things that I've recently been writing about is it's a questioning that the structure of a board, whether it be a hospital board or a corporate board. It's the concept is over 1,000 years old, and it was the actual word board comes from the same root as the word bordello, actually. For all sorts of convoluted linguistic reasons, but we won't go too deeply into that. But the trouble is that things now move so fast. And a board that meets once every month or even less frequently really can't keep its finger on the pulse.
Right.
It's becoming more and more divorced. It's like the ghost with the head under its arm. organizations walking around and here's the board, but actually they're not connected to the head.
Right.
And so when we look at the study of civilizations, the rise and fall of civilizations, and there's a whole field of study called cliodynamics,
Mm-hmm.
which basically modern studies in cliodynamics indicate that civilizations basically collapse every 200 years. And then and collapse might be total collapse, or it could be a complete revolution, a significant revolution in that period of time. But the collapse does not happen from the middle. When we look at the Roman Empire, for example, it became rotten in the middle, but the change came from the outside in, from the borders of the organization. And this is what we're increasingly seeing, that the innovation in organizations is being driven not from the top and not particularly from the bottom because they're powerless. It's being driven from the middle, and particularly the middle that is externally facing. So this phenomenon is suggesting that, if you are in that position, then what you need is the political skills in order to be able to build a caucus for making change happen.
And the art of managing or working with your boss as well, and influencing up and influencing down, and then a caucus at the middle that can affect leadership. This also taps on your perspective on leadership as well, that I see in organizations too, that the old models of command and control and the hero leader are completely done, even though there's many that are still trying to use that model, that we really do need a distributed leadership or shared leadership model. And I think of Lao Tzu, who talks about, in his writing, that the best leader is the one whose followers all say that we did it. Yes. Without the leader, right? So share a little bit about, at that middle place, what's the leadership model that's not the right word. What's the leadership approach that you see in your work that is emerging and affecting real change?
Well, we did a study last year with the conference board, looking at post-COVID leadership. And one of the things that was identified was many of the organizations were saying, the HR directors were saying, a high proportion of the executives are obsolete because they can't let go of command and control. And so they spend more and more time trying to control more and more and achieving less and less. And the other thing was they can't think systemically. And those two things are a recipe for disaster, basically. And if those are role models for the next generation of leaders, we've got a problem.
Right.
And that's a sort of a massive area for HR to get involved with and think, what do we do about this? It's quite clear that that leaders achieve most when they don't try and manage people, but they create the conditions where people can manage themselves. And in our studies there are over 4 million significant books, research theses, and articles and so forth on the traits of leaders, or leadership. And there's just a handful of studies that look at what they actually do and how they add value.
Right.
When we've looked into these, we've gone out and we've shared these with groups of people, with teams, and with bunches of coaches. And we said, okay, so looking at these lists, which of these things can only the leader do? Which need to be reserved only to the leader? And we found examples of almost everything where the team can take part or whole responsibility, then the leader can get on and do something useful. Mm-hmm. And the only two things that came through that have to be done by the leader is that link to the top, getting resources, and getting bringing down the wider vision for the team to interpret it for its purpose. As that's number one. And the number two is protecting the team from interference from outside that might prevent them from doing their job. Everything else can be shared in some way and part or whole with the team.
Yeah, that's an amazing perspective. And it's one that I think rings true for me. And you said something earlier when you first started to describe this that I'd love for you to double click on a little bit. And that is outside of those two major functions that a leader is doing that you found, you also mentioned that they are creating the kind of environment where people can lead themselves. And so, what would you say are some of those ingredients that need to be in an environment where people are leading themselves and really owning the responsibility for those larger things that need to happen too?
I think the first, leaving aside all things of motivation, what do people want to be in the job, and they enjoy the work they do, and
Mhm.
that's a clear part of it. But it comes down to them, the clarity with which they understand what's actually the dynamics around them, the systems around them. If they feel they can influence those in a positive way, then they have a higher sense of efficacy and a greater impulse to accept accountability and to be part of that informal, collaborative, collective leadership.
Mhm.
And the six things that we found in the massive study that we did that that come together to influence whether a team is high performing or not is firstly the purpose and motivation. So, are they all aligned about what they're there for? Is that purpose aligned with what the organization needs from them? And does it turn them on? Do they feel that this is worthwhile? Um, and then you've got the external relationships. Are they listening to their stakeholders, and do the stakeholders want them to succeed? Um, and in many hospital trusts, you on that one that we sometimes get a very low scoring. The sense that well, both in both directions. Then there's the relationships, the level of psychological safety in teams, and of course the classic study that was done in psychological safety was by Amy Evanson. Was looking at US hospitals and doing moving from open heart surgery to keyhole surgery. Um, and that very clearly showed that psychological safety is deeply correlated with team performance. Um, and then you've got the internal processes. How do we make decisions here? How do we coordinate with each other? And so forth. Then you've got two L's. The first L is about how do we learn? How are we adapting sufficiently fast for what's going on in the environment around us? And the second L is leadership, which we've already started to talk about. How do people take accountability, and how is leadership distributed within the team? And basically what we see is that when all those things are working positively together, you get very high performance. But if one or two of them are out of kilter, then the team is not performing at its best. And so, no team's perfect. But paying attention to these things can help you to see if things aren't going the way they should. It'll be an interplay between some of those factors.
I was just thinking that would be an interesting dashboard for a leader to pay attention to. What if the leader's sole focus were those two functions you mentioned, which
Yeah.
is to remove any hindrances for the team, to advocate up for the team, and then those six factors where they focused all their time. What kind of an environment would that create? I think you're right. That would really create an amazing team environment.
Well, we have the diagnostic we have around this. We have two versions. We have a full version for coaches to use, and we also have a very short version, which for the moment at least we are making available for free to any leader that wants to tap into it, so they can apply this to their team and get a sort of benchmark of where are we. And the most important thing that comes out of using that is, you take psychological safety. The leader and a couple of other people may feel there's high psychological safety in the team. But some other people, particularly maybe if they're from a more diverse background or different background,
Mhm.
may feel exactly the opposite. Now,
All
you
right.
need to know that, because that's going to be a drag on people's ability to speak up. It's going to affect innovation. It's whether people are willing to step forward and take leadership for things. So just gathering that data and seeing the pattern, the patterns that emerge, means that you could focus on the causes, not the symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. David, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate your time. And I wanted to ask you a question too, that did I hear that when you do physical exercise, you actually skate?
Oh, I do. Yes,
Did that I thought there's a guy I'm a Canadian. We skate, we're born kind of with skates on our feet. I didn't realize that you're skating in the UK as well.
Well, better than that. I mean, I'm 77. I'm still jumping and spinning. Um, um, somehow. Um, but my fourth son has Down syndrome and autism. So he's 37, going on 5 or 6 mentally. But he skates in this in Special Olympics, or the Special Olympics movement.
Amazing.
So a couple of months ago, we took him to Special Olympics GB, to who are in Italy, and so the whole crew of them, kids with Down syndrome and other learning difficulties. And little Jonathan came back with a gold medal.
Oh, wow. Congratulations. That's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you for that. So I want to be respectful of your time. And just as we wrap up now, how can people get in touch with you? Or first of all, what are you working on that's really got your attention right now and that you're passionate about? And then how can people get in touch with you?
Well, I think the thing that that's really got getting me going at the moment is reciprocal mentoring. Now, that's something that's probably people may not have heard of, but if you think about reverse mentoring, somebody at the top can learn about the world as it looks from somebody who's less advantaged, or through the eyes of somebody who's less advantaged, and maybe that person at the top can help that less advantaged person understand the politics and how to get on in the organization. So there is a reciprocality going on here, but it's very limited in terms of its impact because it just affects 2 people. And there's some cause for concern that it may be unintentionally making things worse, because lots of people say, "Oh, look, so and so benefited from being in that relationship. Tick the box, we've done that."
Right.
And so reciprocal mentoring goes a lot further. It says we're going to put people together in co-learning pairs. So they're going to be learning about each other's world. They're going to be learning to think, to appreciate each other's world, but they're also going to come together to identify together systemic barriers to change, to diversity and inclusion. And then the whole cohort comes together to develop organizational strategies that address them from above and from below.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a radical innovation.
That's amazing.
And I think just to give you an example of one person, in one organization that did this, we had one of the top team that was from an Indian background. I'm not sure if he was born in the UK or not, but anyway, sort of Indian origined UK, and he reported that he'd been working with a young woman, a young black woman, who was highly vocal and ambitious, but she talked about what the world looked like from her perspective, from where she sat in the organization, and she talked about not being listened to.
Right.
And the guy said, it suddenly made me realize, he said, I've got 3 boys and 3 girls. He said, I spent a lot of time with my sons, talking with them and listening to them. He said, I realized I spent hardly any time with my daughters. And he said, it's totally changed my family dynamics.
Wow.
I think that's just an individual little impact, but those little things, those little stories are what really make you, they get you, don't they?
Yeah, I love that story because it might be individual impact, but the ripple effect of that generationally is going to be huge for those girls in that family. And so I love that. So how can people get in touch with you, David, to see the work that you're doing?
2 major routes. One, by all means, on LinkedIn. So they're very easy to find on LinkedIn. But the other is through my website, which is www.clutterbuck-cmi.com.
All right, we'll include that in the show notes as well, and we'll also include the leadership assessment that you mentioned earlier as well, that you're providing for free, generously providing for free. So I'll include that as well. David, thank you so much for your time.
If people want that they can go straight to the website and ask for it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for your time again, and it's just been a delight talking to you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to the end of this episode. And remember that all the information from the episode that's relevant is in the show notes. And by all means, please reach out to Professor Clutterbuck with questions on LinkedIn and also on his website. Thank you again for listening. And remember to be a safe space. Thank you again for getting to the end of this podcast. And if you enjoyed this and you found that there was value in it for you, my invitation is for you to subscribe for future episodes that come out weekly on Tuesdays. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to being with you next time. Now remember to be a safe space.